Last time I was here, I was co-teaching with my good friend Renee, and he's got this incredible way that he kind of draws out of people some of their best thinking and selves. And we were talking about queer liberation. And so we spoke a lot about individual and collective liberation in queer communities. And, something that really was heavy in my heart that I felt like was such an important part of that conversation was this mudra of the Buddha, right? In the story of, sitting under the Bodhi tree, and Mara comes and the Buddha is contemplating. He's about to awaken, and this being comes and says, by whose right do you think you get to awaken? Like, how dare you? And then these tempting thoughts and these demons that are very scary, just trying to distract the Buddha before his awakening. And at some point, he goes and puts his hand on the ground and touches the earth and says, by the earth's nature, the earth has my back. It's my birthright to awaken. And I felt like that was so queer. It was so like part of the shared queer gay experience of me and some of my like friends. Like, we have to just know that the earth has our back and that we have a right to live our full best lives. And sometimes there's distractors and temptations of falling into this very like the way we're socialized, the way that we suffer as queer people because of the heteronormativity, because of misogyny, because of gender bias. Like, there's so many ways in which we share suffering. So that was what took me to kind of my contemplation for tonight. I'll start with, Buddhism isn't all about suffering, but there's a lot of conversation. The Four Noble Truths begin with the truth that like there's suffering in all lives. Nobody comes through this experience of being alive without suffering. Different perspectives in different ways, and yet what is the utility of this universal fact that we all suffer? And so many of the teachings in the Dharma kind of are rooted there. The Four Noble Truths go on to acknowledge that there's a cause of the suffering and that there's an end to the suffering. And that's one of my favorite teachings. It's around the third noble truth that the end of suffering can happen. And then the fourth noble truth that there's these eightfold paths and there's a way to get there. But I've often thought about the fact that the ending of suffering may not be complete. It may not be like the light bulb goes on and then there's no more suffering. It may be more in incremental moments. That I've had moments in life where the suffering was small or felt like it wasn't existent. So maybe those moments of non-suffering where it ends, but maybe it comes back again. So I work with that in my practice, connecting the dots between the suffering that I experience, but also that in those succession of suffering, there is a lot of joy. And so in the moments when I have felt very focused, very in alignment with my life and my values, when things are going really well and I don't experience a lot of suffering, there is a lot of joy. And yet the texture of the joy is directly related to the suffering. I imagine that my life with no suffering would be very difficult to identify like what joy is. And so what is the relationship? And that's what I want to kind of contemplate and talk about tonight. Interested in connecting the dots between suffering and joy and some of the contradictions. There's this teaching of in every life there will be 10,000 joys and 10,000 sorrows. You've probably heard this. It's like, what does it mean to have both? And what if we become attached to the joys and resistant to the suffering? That just leads to more suffering. So there's a quote I pulled from Jack Kornfield. Jack Kornfield said, being alive is finding ourselves in the midst of this great and mysterious paradox. There are 10,000 joys and sorrows in every life, and at one time or another, we will be touched by all of them. We'll all experience birth and death, success and loss, love and heartbreak, joy and despair. And in every moment of your life, there are millions of humans just like you all over the world who are being confronted with situations just like yours. Some are joyful and some are overwhelming, where they are struggling to somehow learn how to survive them. I appreciate that perspective because it can feel very individual. My practice and experience, the suffering can feel very targeted. It can feel very specific to me. And it's hard to remember to pull up to the meta version. It's hard to, on our own, it's hard to identify that these sufferings are not, inherent to us and belong only to us, because it can feel that way, very heavy in my chest. And I'm lucky to have, deep community and friends, especially friends in Sangha, especially friends in the movement. Like if we're all kind of working, this Kalyana Mita, this like spiritual friendship, like they're so important that in those places where I get kind of myopic, my dear friends can pull me out and remind me. One of the things that they often remind me about is, that there are, there's two types of suffering. There's one suffering that leads to more suffering, and then there's suffering that leads to the end of suffering. More about that in just a minute. I want to pull my attention to the times when joy has actually led to sorrow and vice versa, right? I experienced a direct connection between these two states of mind, states of being, and I just was thinking of sharing a few examples. I remember kind of being out in the world after I had left my mother's house, and it occurred to me that I can do mostly what I want, right? This autonomy that comes with kind of my development. Right. I felt very there was an empowerment moment when I went from living with my mother and in family to kind of starting my own place. Sometimes the funny parts are oh, I can have ice cream for dinner if I want, or oh, I can, I just remember experiencing a lot of joy and autonomy. I'm on my own and I can make things my way. I have more control over what my life will be like, and that joy that came. And part of that was around my queer identity. I can investigate relationships. I can investigate different types of ways of being that are up to me that I couldn't before. And there was such joy in there. And, also being in a deep relationship. I got married 4 years ago, and, happiest day of my life. So much joy with this man, Randy, and so much connection. I can't think of a more mudita, spontaneous joy that just keeps coming and coming in relationship. And also suffering. My last example is really about, my family. My family is a deep place of practice. And there's so much joy in experiencing this summer. I got to spend time with my family for the first time in a year. It was just overjoyed to see my aunt and my family and these new babies. And there was a lot of suffering in my specific family tied to my racial identity, my queerness that is not accepted or understood in so many different ways. And so from this very autonomous place in the world, I get to make my own decisions. I'm going to live my own life. It came with a lot of suffering around what are the causes and conditions, that I suffered through in that independence. I also had times of being very alone. That independence and autonomy also led me to really destructive and difficult, life choices. When I think about my relationship with my husband, yes, there's this joy, but there's also deep suffering. The closeness and proximity that this man has in my heart, really has caused some of my deepest scars. How do I move through that, knowing that the joy is connected to the suffering that I've experienced in that relationship? Certainly the same in the family. I think about queer joy and the ways that, this past Pride was different because of the pandemic, and yet there are so many places that I see really beautiful sharings online about queer joy and how we experience it. So I just point to the place that there's a lot of joy and suffering that are connected. And then the reverse of that is some of the suffering that I've experienced. The greatest loss in my whole entire life was losing my mother in 2015. I fell into such a deep, dark place, and people would tell me oh, thank God you have your practice to lean into. And yes and no, it's very difficult. But I found that, even in that suffering, 5 years later, I can talk about the experience of my mother's transition and know that there was a utility of it for her. Knowing that her body was not serving her the same way she wanted to do, and that she suffered a lot towards the end. So her transition, while the deepest sorrow I've experienced, also had this joy. I was very happy for her. So I just point back and forth to the joy and the suffering. Then there's this other concept of equanimity, right? Upekkha in Pali. Another quote from Tricycle magazine. The Buddha described a mind filled with equanimity, or upekkha, abundant, exalted, immeasurable, without hostility and without ill will. Can you imagine a mind that had no endeavors to like towards ill will? Equanimity translates to two separate words in Pali used by the Buddha, upekkha, um, which is the more common term. It means to look over. It refers to the equanimity that arises from the power of observation, the ability to see without being caught in what we see. When well developed, such a power gives rise to a great sense of peace, our ability not to be swept up in the thought, or our ability to be aware that we can look over some of these feelings or thoughts and not get swept up in them. The ability that the Buddha says that there are two kinds of suffering, the kind that leads to more suffering and the kind that brings the end to suffering. Which one are we practicing? At what point can we choose how our practice allows us to be with suffering, but not be swept away with it? Another quote is attributed to the Buddha: when we are touched with the feeling of pain, or the ordinary uninstructed person sorrows and grieves and laments and beats his breast and becomes distraught, so he feels two pains, physical and mental, as if there were to shoot a man with an arrow and right afterward to shoot him with another one. Right? This teaching of the second arrow, which is, the suffering that we experience is one hurt, but do we endeavor to continue and expand that hurt? Just a couple of quick examples. The second arrow for me often comes online when I'm digesting Facebook and other media. There's the suffering of the realization of sometimes the harm in the world that I experience. And then there's how I engage with it. I'm gonna respond to that. I'm gonna post this. I'm gonna tell, and then I find myself just getting wrapped up in it so easily and so quickly. In my friendships, there are ways that I'm experiencing the suffering, like a fight with a friend, and I can tell myself all kinds of stories about the history of a friendship and why they have something that I don't have, and I'm quick to go to the second arrow sometimes in my friends. And so I just want to end with sharing what's been really helpful to me in those places is to notice it, talk about it, right? Similar to our practice of noticing these thoughts arising. Is it pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, but not get all the way swept up in it. And I also want to point to my dear friends and, in the practice, being in Sangha with you all and in community here, there's such a great opportunity to share and be reminded of kind of the larger picture, to be more quantumous, because we have better perspectives within different when we share it with our Sangha and our loved ones. So I will close here for the moment, and I hope that something that I shared tonight was helpful to you. I invite you to continue thinking about how you connect your joys and sorrow and how that moves you into your life.